Our next speaker joins us from sunnier climes. He is at the University in Pisa and at UCLA, so comes to us from Italy and California. Please welcome Carlo Ginzburg.
The tension between morphology and history is at the very heart of Aby Warburg's work, both published and unpublished. Within that tension, the notion of pathos formeln played a key role. These statements are self-evident. Hopefully, what I'm going to say will be less so. A few years ago, I gave a talk at the Warburg Institute in which I advanced a new argument about the genesis of Warburg's pathos formeln. My lecture has been published, but so far not in English. A quick resume of my argument will pave the way to some new developments in my ongoing research. In a passage of his Civilization of Renaissance in Italy, dealing with the role played by ancient triumphs in carnival festivals in 15th century Rome, Burckhardt wrote, quote, "Whenever pathos emerged, it took an ancient form," end quote. According to Ernst Gombrich, these words were the very seed of Warburg's pathos formeln. Gombrich's fleeting suggestion, a single line in a footnote of his intellectual biography of Aby Warburg, must be taken seriously. But that seed, I've argued, fell upon a ground that had been fertilized by intellectual experiences of a different kind. In his what is this? No, sorry. There is something wrong here. Anyway, I was going to show an image which has been shown already, meaning, taken from, referring to Aby Warburg 1905 lecture. In his published essays, Warburg made a sparing use of the notion of pathos formeln. On the contrary, in the large mass of unpublished notes he went on jotting down along the years, pathos formeln surfaced over and over again like a sort of obsession. Inspired by Wolfgang Hosthoff's research into the alleged primitive features of superlative, Warburg compared iconic formulae based on gestures to verbal superlatives, primordial words of passionate gesticulation. According to Hosthoff, one of the features of those primordial words was ambivalence, a trait which Warburg extended to pathos formeln. In the Renaissance, some ancient pathos formeln re-emerged with an opposite meaning, as the Mary Magdalene that Bertoldo di Giovanni, the Florentine sculptor who was among Donatello's disciples, represented in his crucifixion. In his unpublished lecture on the entrance of ideal style all'antica in early Renaissance painting, Warburg described Bertoldo's Mary Magdalene as a Maenad. In the Mnemosyne Atlas, the project which occupied the last years of Warburg's life, Bertoldo's crucifixion is displayed twice as a whole and as a detail, as an example of inverted energy, or energetic inversion, more literally. 10 years later, after the forced exile of the library to London, the first issue of the Journal of the Warburg Institute came out. It included a dense note, 2 pages long, by Edgar Wendt, entitled "The Maenad Under the Cross, Comments on an Observation by Reynolds." Wendt analyzed a passage from Reynolds' Discourses on Art, elicited by a drawing by Baccio Bandinelli, Reynolds, who at that time on the drawing, I would like to apologize for the bad quality of those images. They are just reminders. Reynolds had made a free copy of it. And here we have another drawing by Baccio Bandinelli. The artist, Reynolds pointed out, had drawn inspiration from, quote, a figure of a bacchante leaning backward, her head thrown quite behind her, which seems to be a favorite invention, as it is so frequently repeated in bas-reliefs, cameos, and intaglios. It is intended to express an enthusiastic, frantic kind of joy, unquote. In his drawing, Reynolds went on, Baccio Bandinelli used the figure of the bacchante to depict an image of Mary under the cross, quote, to express frantic agony of grief, unquote. Hence, Reynolds' conclusion, quote, it is curious to observe, and it is certainly true, that the extremes of contrary passions are, with very little variation, expressed by the same action, end of quote. And here is Vince's comment. Warburg had collected images like Bertoldo di Giovanni's Mary Magdalene, or this Maenad, quote, which tended to show that similar gestures can assume opposite meaning without knowing of this passage in Reynolds' discourses, end of quote. On this point, Vint was wrong. Warburg had become aware of Reynolds' passage in a context that clarifies the genesis of the notion of pathos formel and also some elements of its subsequent history. The chain of transmission I discovered was quite obvious, although, if I'm not mistaken, it had been strangely overlooked. In 1888, as Sigrid Weigel reminded us, the 22-year-old Warburg was preparing a seminar for August Schmarzow in the Biblioteca Nazionale in Florence, came across a copy of Charles Darwin's famous book, The Expression of the Emotions in Men and Animals. The comment, as we have been reminded yesterday, he then made in his diary, is well known. At last, a book which can help me. Might this remark also be related to the notion of pathos formel? This possibility had been raised several times in more or less vague terms, but all future interpretations will have to mention a passage from chapter 8 of Darwin's The Expression of Emotions, entitled Joy, High Spirits, Love, Tender Feelings, Devotion. Commenting on the continuity between extreme emotional attitudes, Darwin wrote, quote, a graduated series can be followed from violent to moderate laughter, to a broad smile, to a gentle smile, and to the expression of mere cheerfulness. During excessive laughter, the whole body is often thrown backward and shakes, or is almost convulsed. The respiration is much disturbed. The head and face become gorged with blood, with the veins distended, and the orbicular muscles are spasmodically contracted in order to protect the eyes. Tears are freely shed. Hence, as formerly remarked, it is scarcely possible to point out any difference between the tear-stained face of a person after a paroxysm of excessive laughter and after a bitter crying fit. End of quote. To this passage, Darwin added a footnote, quote, Sir Joshua Reynolds remarks, it is curious to observe, quote within quote, and it is certainly true that the extremes of contrary passions are, with very little variations, expressed by the same action. And then Darwin, he, Reynolds, gives as an instance the frantic joy of a bacchante and the grief of a Mary Magdalene, end of quote. Warburg read Darwin, who had read Reynolds. The first link of this backward chain, Warburg's reading of Darwin, has been brilliantly addressed by Sigrid Weigel at this conference. What about the second link, Darwin's reading of Reynolds? The expression of emotions in men and animals, published in 1872, had a long genesis, documented by two notebooks, labeled M and N, written in 1838, when Darwin was 29. Both notebooks include critical comments on a passage from Reynolds' seventh discourse, in which, quote, the reality of a standard in taste, as well as in corporeal beauty, was opposed to a false and depraved taste, identifiable as such on the basis of, quote, a knowledge derived from the uniformity of sentiments among mankind, from whence proceeds the knowledge of what are the general habits of nature, the result of which is an idea of perfect beauty, end of quote. Darwin objected. Sir Joshua Reynolds' explanation may perhaps account for our acquiring the instinct, in italics, and slash, one notion of beauty and Negroes another, but it does not explain the feeling in any one man, end of quote. In other words, Darwin thought that racial and cultural diversity disproved Reynolds' general idea of beauty rooted in nature. In the next notebook, Darwin unfolded the implications of his argument. Quote, the existence of taste in human mind is to me clear evidence of the general ideas of our ancestors being impressed on us, end of quote. One can see from those notes how deeply Darwin's inner dialogue with Reynolds affected his later work. In the early notebooks, there is no trace of Reynolds' passage from the 12th discourse, in which the Bacchante's enthusiastic, frantic kind of joy was compared with one of the Mary's frantic agony of grief. But in 1838, Darwin was already reflecting on the puzzling contiguity between expressions of opposite emotions. A passage on fears and tears in children and adults led him to raise two questions. Quote, but why does joy and other emotions, Darwin's italics, make grown-up people cry? What is emotion? A quick reference followed. Quote, at the end of Burke's essay on the sublime and beautiful, there are some notes, likewise in Wordsworth's dissertation on poetry, end of quote. Reynolds' name might also have been included in the list. In a famous passage of his autobiography, Darwin wrote, quote, many of the pictures in the National Gallery in London gave me much pleasure. That of Sebastiano del Piombo, meaning the raising of Lazarus, exciting in me a sense of sublimity, end of quote. Sebastiano del Piombo as an example of sublimity implied Michelangelo and Reynolds' judgment on Michelangelo. The sublime in painting, as in poetry, Reynolds wrote, so overpowers and takes such a possession of the whole mind that no room is left for attention to minute criticism, end of quote. This implicit reference to Pseudo-Longinus on the sublime became explicit in another passage, declaring the hierarchy on which the discourses on art are based. Quote, to the question, therefore, which ought to hold the first rank, Raffaele or Michelangelo, it must be answered that if it is to be given to him who possessed a greater combination of the higher qualities of the art than any other man, there is no doubt that Raffaele is the first. But if, according to Longinus, the sublime being the highest excellence that human composition can attain to, abundantly compensates the absence of every other beauty and atones for all other deficiencies, then Michelangelo demands the preference, end of quote. The discourses literally end with the name of Michelangelo, that truly divine man. Both this and the impact on Reynolds of Pseudo-Longinus on the sublime are well known. But a closer look at these issues will clarify Reynolds' indirect, or maybe direct, contribution to the genesis of pathos formel, a contribution which looks, retrospectively, fundamental. In a nutshell, my argument is the following. Reynolds' remark, quote, that the extremes of contrary passions are with very little variation expressed by the same action, end of quote, is an imaginative response to Pseudo-Longinus on the sublime. Allow me to quote a passage from Boileau's Art Poétique, published in 1673, 1 year before his own translation du Sublime, which spread the impact of Pseudo-Longinus' work all over Europe. Here is Boileau. Que dans tous vos discours la passion émue aille chercher le cœur, l'échauffe et les remue. Si d'un beau mouvement l'agréable fureur souvent ne nous remplit d'une douce terreur, ou n'excite à notre âme une pitié charmante, en vain vous étalez une scène savante. In all you write, observe with care and art to move the passions and incline the heart. If, in elaborate act, the pleasing rage cannot our hopes and fears by turns engage, nor in our mind a feeling pity raise, in vain with learned scenes you fill your place. Agréable fureur, literally pleasant rage, douce terreur, sweet terror, pitié charmante, charming compassion. A fundamental feature of the sublime and of its reception, starting from Boileau, is oxymoron. Michelangelo's terribilità was also, of course, an oxymoronic term, first used by Sebastiano del Piombo in a letter addressed to Michelangelo himself, dated November the 9th, 1520. Quote, you seem to be terribile, only as far as art is concerned, since you are the greatest master who has ever existed. End of quote. The ambivalent meaning of terribile would be conveyed by the English word awesome, not awful. But in the long run, Michelangelo's terribilità was filtered and reinforced by the success of Pseudo-Longinus on Sublime. One of its crucial passages conveyed for the first time in a fragmentary form the Greek text of a famous ode by Sappho. In my eyes he matches the gods, that man who sits there facing you, previously known only from its Latin reworking by Catullus. Sappho's detailed description of pain associated with love, quote, cold sweat covers me, and the trembling takes a hold of me all over. I'm greener than the grass is, and appear to myself to be little short of dying. End of quote. We can measure the shock generated by this poem, as well as the distance from its later reception, from a comment made in 1572 by Francesco Anguilla, an otherwise unknown Italian poet, who translated and commented Sappho's poem. Notwithstanding Catullus' Odi et amo, notwithstanding Petrarch's et temo et spero et ardo e sono un ghiaccio, Anguilla strongly emphasized that contradictory feelings cannot coexist at the same time in the same individual, but only in a sometimes very fast sequence. More than a century later, in 1698, an English translation of the Essay upon Sublime, compared with Boileau's French translation, was published in Oxford. The anonymous translator commented upon Sappho's ode as follows, quote, are you not raptured to see how she, Sappho, humors all things? Her soul, her body, her tongue, her ears, her beauty are drawn as so many different persons just at the point of expiring. And with what contrary passions is she moved? She freezes, she burns, she's mad, she's wise, she's very wise, she's afraid her heart is just bursting. that one would think that she was not possessed by only one passion, but that the whole circle of them made a general, jarring rendezvous in her breast, all true symptoms of those who are far gone in love. End of quote. Whether or not Reynolds read on the sublime in this 1698 edition, we don't know. The comment from which I took my quotation was stolen by Zachary Spears, Bishop of Bangor, who translated it into Latin in his edition of Pseudo Longinus. But the description of opposite passions converging into one individual, drawn as so many different persons, might have paved the way to Reynolds' recognition of opposite passions being drawn in one form, or, as Aby Warburg said, formula. It seems reasonable to assume that Warburg, having come across in a footnote of the expression of emotions in men and animals, Reynolds' comparison between the Bacchante and Mary, must have looked for the source of the quote, Reynolds' discourses on art. But even if a direct proof of this reading will never be found, the chain which emerged seems unquestionable. I will reassert it according to its chronological order. First, Pseudo Longinus and its reception. Second, Reynolds' discourses on art. Third, Darwin's The Expression of Emotions in Men and Animals. And fourth, Aby Warburg. As we have seen, Warburg discovered, or as we would say in Latin, invented, pathos formel when he first read Darwin's book, or just after the belated use of that notion until the lecture on Dürer and the Italian perception of antiquity delivered in Hamburg in October 1905 looks surprising. Even more surprising, in a sense, is a detail I would like to share again with you. At the end of his life, as we know from his notebooks, Warburg and Bing visited Orvieto. In that occasion, he saw again Signorelli's fresco representing the entombment of Christ in the chapel of San Brizio. Warburg must have looked at this fresco as a recapitulation of some of his favorite notions, as well as a striking proof of their philological accuracy. On the one hand, grisaille in the sarcophag as a deliberate distancing device, conveying a sense of temporal distance, reinforced by linear perspective. On the other, the analogy between painting and grisaille, between the dead Christ and Meleagros, the mythical pagan hero, a perfect example of pathos formel. But Warburg will have also recalled to have included a detail from Signorelli's entombment in a table of the Mnemosyne Atlas, along with photographs reproducing Donatello's entombment of Christ from Padua, Ghirlandaio's grisaille with the death of Meleagros, Bertoldo di Giovanni's Maenad under the cross. The title of the table was Pathos of Energetic Inversion, Leiden Pathos in Energetischer Inversion. This is the detail chosen by, okay, this is the detail from Signorelli, and this is the detail chosen by Warburg. By isolating the sarcophagus, with the bas-relief representing Meleagros' corpse being carried over by his companions, Warburg's scissors suppressed the analogy with the entombment of Christ, and the pathos formel as historical relationship disappeared. In the Mnemosyne project, based on pathos formel, ahistorical morphology had become the dominating force. In the past, first and foremost, in the lecture on Dürer and the Italian perception of antiquity, this had not been the case. What makes Aby Warburg's intellectual legacy so impressive is his energy in looking at the two sides of the relationship between morphology and history, sometimes as distinct, sometimes as interacting forces. Warburg's unflagging experimental attitude is part of his work's enduring impact.